In this video, we are going to follow the successional pathway in South Jersey, starting of course with early succession. So this is in the year or two following a major disturbance event. What we're going to see is pioneer species, things like grasses, pitch pine, and eastern red cedar colonizing the land that was previously disturbed. And so our first example is this field here. It was last disturbed about a year and a half ago with a mower. And so what we can see is lots of grasses, of course, and right in the foreground here is an eastern red cedar. And so that's a year or two of growth. They do grow very quickly and create some nice vertical habitat to attract animals. Another example is the land right across from the movie theater and the Hamilton Mall. This was cleared about 5 years ago. It was a fully mature forest with pitch pine, oak, and hickory that was cleared for development that never really happened. Right? They built a Starbucks there just a year ago. But this is what remains. And so what's happening in both of these different examples is that the land was cleared, right, with a mower or with chainsaw, and so now that land in between, or that is surrounded by forest, has to be repopulated by seeds carried by animals, right, and also carried by the wind. And so in the top part of this image here, we can see that there are animals that venture out into this open area. We'll see in just a moment some of the animals that are really good at this and they really like to be out in the open, but either way, they are going to disperse seeds out farther and farther from the forest, and those plants, right, so the grasses, the eastern red cedar, the pitch pine, are all going to start to grow up, and as they do so, they are going to create vertical structure. They are going to literally change the climate on the ground to be more protective for more mature forest species. So species that would never venture out into an open field, they must be protected by both shade and by the physical environment that a tree or a shrub or even grass that is laid over can provide. And so what we can see at the bottom of this image is those initial pioneer species growing taller and taller and taller, and over time closing in that canopy. And so going back to that site across from the mall by the new Starbucks, what we can see here is in the background what this forest used to be and also what is still existing now. So this is still supporting the birds and the lizards and the bats that are going to be spreading these seeds out into the field. Okay, and so this savanna really is colonized only by grasses, right, which definitely attract a lot of pollinators, and also these pitch pines. And so we can actually see some pitch pines in the background that are still providing the seeds to this site. And so what types of organisms are really important in South Jersey savannas, right, so these early successional grasslands? Well, we actually have a couple species that are threatened, right? So the grasshopper sparrow and the red-headed woodpecker up above in the two corners. Both of these are threatened species. Both of these absolutely require grasslands in order to be able to hunt, in order to be able to live. Eastern cottontails, so these are rabbits that are very common around here. They generally aren't found deep in the forest. They might burrow at the edge of a forest, but generally they are going to eat grasses that are found in the savanna. And so these organisms, of course, are great vectors for seed dispersal. Grasses and wildflowers, the weedy things, are great at attracting pollinators. Right? So we actually have a couple pretty exciting butterfly species that we can see there in the middle, and of course their predators. Birds, such as flycatchers, actually perch on the edge of the forest, and they fly out, scoop up some insects, and take them back into the forest. And so they love to hunt at the interface between forest and savanna. What we can see down in the left corner is a quail, and quails are essentially a tasty snack for all sorts of different predators, and so they respond to this by actually living only in the grasslands. They almost create tunnels in the fallen over grass, right? So they can run around under the grasses and not actually be susceptible to getting hunted by something like a kestrel off to the right. In the quail picture, we can actually see that they build their nests from fallen down grasses as well. Okay. And finally, the American kestrel we can see here has hunted a lizard. He's very excited about that. All right, so now let's go back to Stockton. All right, and so what I want to point out is that for a couple decades, this corner here at the entrance to Stockton was just an open field. Now, of course, Stockton has started to mow this area, but we can still see the remnants of succession behind. So if we go back to our successional pathway, what we can see is that if we allow those early successional forests or savannas to keep on growing, those little plants, right, so the red cedar and the pitch pine, are going to grow into shrubs. Right? And so what we'll see here next is that the pitch pine is going to keep on growing tall, and in the understory we're going to see that there are other plants that are going to come into play. So we could see the bushy red cedar. We can also see in the foreground here that there are some oaks still holding onto their leaves that are growing in the understory. These have to be sheltered by other plants when they first start growing. So these are definitely mid to late successional plants. Right? So here we see another oak, couple oaks actually, with the fluffy brown leaves in the foreground, and again they are sheltered by these pioneer species, which of course have grown a lot over time to be able to facilitate the growth of these more mature forest species. And of course we can still see the red cedar, which was part of this early successional forest, but now has grown up to be a more mature forest. We can also see some remnants of this at home in our parking lots. Right? Here we can see oaks, which are growing in the understory, protected by the pine trees up above. Right, so the dark almost black bark is the pitch pine. We can see that before we had parking lots here, this forest was dominated by pitch pines, and now it is growing and allowing the progression to a mature forest. Now, on our flowchart here, we see that if there is no fire, right, so we're not burning our parking lots, what we can see is that the oak and hickory are going to become dominant. You'll still see a lot of pitch pines, but for the most part, you start to see the appearance of these other types of species. Again, the oaks and the hickories, you'll be able to see the leaves on at this time of year. All right, so here we have, again, on campus, in the understory, we see the kind of fluffy purplish plant that is a wild blueberry or huckleberry, highbush blueberry, and in the background we see green evergreens. Those are called mountain laurel, and they provide great cover for deer. We can also see in the understory oaks and hickories and pitch pines in the overstory. So here, again, we are progressing from mid-successional to a late successional forest. Okay, now what happens if we just keep on disturbing that mid-successional forest? And actually, South Jersey forests are very much adapted to this type of condition. Right? So if we, for example, mow or graze a early to mid-successional forest, as has been done here, what we see is that the savanna keeps on being kind of knocked back. We can see in the background here the red cedars and the pitch pines. Those have not been mowed, and so they serve as a great contrast to what disturbance can actually do. Right, so off to the right here, these red cedars are on their way to being a mid-successional forest. And the mowed regions are where the disturbance keeps on taking place. And so let us cut to the field, what is now a field, where CVS is in. What we can see in the foreground is the construction, right, disturbance, and in the background we can see what this field used to look like, right? So very much on its way to being a mid to late successional forest. Another type of disturbance, which doesn't necessarily clear cut, is roads. Right? So what you can see is a mid to late successional forest surrounding this road which has been built through. And so along the edges of the road we can see pioneer species like the eastern red cedar, and also the pitch pine. So if we go back to our successional pathway, we see that the mature forest with oaks and hickories is what happens if there is no fire. And so the Pine Barrens of South Jersey is a very unique ecosystem in that the dominant forest type is not oaks and hickories, as would be expected within this type of climate, but in fact it is the pines. It is the same exact pioneer species that begins the successional pathway. And so the reason why this is the case is because the disturbance regime is so intense with fires historically every 3 to 5 years. Essentially, the oaks and hickories are not resistant to fire, and they don't produce seeds within that time frame. So a 3-year-old oak plant is not going to be producing acorns. However, pitch pines can start to produce acorns within 3 years, it has been shown. Also, pitch pines are adapted in a lot of other ways to actually be resistant to fire, and we're going to take a look at that. And so, mature forests in South Jersey, particularly within the Pine Barrens, have adapted to a frequent fire regime, and as a result, the mature forests are pitch pine dominated. What we will also see in these pitch pine forests are things like lichen and mosses. Carnivorous plants are really common in these mature forests as well. So what we're going to see here is a couple different forests within the Pine Barrens. You should take a look at how abundant these pitch pines are, even though these forests are, well over 100 years old. Okay, as opposed to what we see in our parking lots. All right, so what we see here is some tea berries, which are very taste like winter fresh gum. We also see my dog Ted, but what I want to point out is just how many pitch pines there are in this forest. Right, you might see 1 or 2 oaks, but for the most part, it's all pitch pine. Next, here's some mosses with all the little spore fights. So these guys are just about to release their spores into the world. And again, lots and lots of pitch pine. And here is some what is called fruticose lichen. All right, and what we can see in this particular video is actually a tree fall gap. Right, so there's actually trees falling down all the time, leaving these gaps in the canopy and allowing these little sapling pitch pine trees to recolonize. We've seen 2 different mature forest types in South Jersey. We have seen the oak hickory forests, and we have seen the pitch pine forests. Now, every time you see a pitch pine forest, that indicates that fire has had an important role in that particular ecosystem. Oak hickory forest, which of course have pitch pines within them, have not had fire as a major player in that particular ecosystem. And so what this should indicate to you is that pitch pine is adapted to fire and maybe even requires fire in order to be successful, whereas the hardwoods like oak and hickory are not adapted to fire. And so I am going to show you a clip that I made to demonstrate how pitch pines in particular are adapted to fire in just one way, and there of course are many ways, but one way in which pitch pines are adapted to fire as compared to some other pine species. This is a demonstration of how fire affects 2 different species of pine, both of which can live in the climate of South Jersey. Both can live in the soil conditions, but what makes these 2 different pine species different is their adaptations to fire. And the first thing that we're going to see is a pitch pine cone. So the one that you saw on the right, when the pitch pine cone is exposed to heat of the fire for even just a second or 2, what we see is that those scales, which were formerly closed up, now are loosened, right? So the resin that actually kind of glues these scales together melts away, given exposure to fire, and actually opens the cone. And so as we can see on the right, after the fire, the cone is open and the seeds can therefore be spread. However, when we go back and we do the same exact thing to the white pine, which is not as adapted to fire, what we see is we can put it in the fire for just a second or two, and immediately the eastern white pine is a fiery inferno. And so this fire is going to destroy the pine cone, as opposed to opening the pine cone and allowing its seeds to actually be spread. So, just to drive this point home, we can do the same thing again with the pitch pine cone. Again, the scales are closed, and we can keep it in the fire for quite a long time. Right? So this just keeps going on, and the pine cone just won't catch on fire. And so ultimately it's going to catch flame just a little bit, but still not the fiery inferno that we saw with the eastern white pine. And so, once again, the pitch pine cones are actually benefited by being exposed to a fire. Okay? And so when we actually expose them for an even longer period of time, what we see is that those scales completely detach, and so now each one of these little scales with the seed at the base is able to blow in the wind and therefore disperse even farther than it did before. Okay, and so what we see here is yet another example of an evolutionary trade-off of serratinous cones. And so we can see at the bottom of this image that the serratinous cones and evolutionary trade-off are blue and underlined, meaning that they are important vocabulary words for us. The trade-off of this trait is that, if we look to the right, pitch pines, their seeds are not really released without fire, right? They need a fire to be a regular part of their environment. If not, their seeds just aren't readily dispersed. And so the next generations of pitch pines will not be able to thrive because there aren't seeds for colonization. On the other hand, though, eastern white pines do very well in areas without a lot of fire. Right? So here we can see that the pine cones are always open. This is how they come off of the tree, and so the seeds are already exposed to the outside world, and they can grow as soon as the conditions are right. And so these white pines do very well in areas that do not have a lot of fire. However, if the white pines are exposed to fire, the entire cone is burnt up, and they cannot recolonize that area after a fire because there is no seed bed. Okay, but of course the pitch pines, they can thrive after a fire, not only because the fire actually opens up the cones and allows for the seeds to spread, but also the fire is going to destroy the competition. Okay, so both of these are equally viable species, but pitch pine is very much adapted to an area with frequent fires, whereas white pine cones, which are not serratinous, they are not. While forest fires are a critical part of maintaining a pitch pine forest, the more and more people that move into this area, the more forest fires have to be controlled, and for centuries they were in fact prevented. And so what happened was that, first of all, the pine barrens kind of shrunk. Right, so you start to see the encroachment of more and more oak hickory forest in the absence of fire to maintain this very unique ecosystem. But also, anytime there is an actual forest fire, it is just out of control, right? So much leaf litter, including, of course, actual leaves and also pine cones, pine needles, sticks, all sorts of things build up on the forest floor. And so when a forest fire does actually occur, it is really hard to control. And so, if you drive through the pine barrens, and even if you drive through campus, you will see evidence, as we're seeing here, of what are called controlled burns. Now, these are providing a lot of the good aspects of fire, right? So opening serratinous cones, decreasing the number of competitors, also super cool things like reducing the number of ticks that are going to be present the following year. So all these wonderful things of fire, but in a very controlled way. And so in the event of an actual forest fire, it is a lot easier to control and put the fire out because there's much less leaf litter, there's less of a thick understory to allow the fire to what is called crown, or actually go up to the tops of the trees and actually kill the trees instead of doing all the beneficial things that it can do on the forest floor. And so that's why, driving around campus, especially in the spring, you might see that there are controlled burns happening.